Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honoured if you subscribed. Picture this. It's 1889, and Paris is at the height of its glory. The Eiffel Tower has just been completed, the Moulin Rouge is opening its doors, and the city pulses with art, culture, and endless possibility. But beneath this glittering surface, something sinister is brewing in the cafes and cabarets of Montmartre. A bright green fairy is dancing through the veins of Parisians, whispering promises of creativity and escape, but delivering madness and murder instead. What I'm about to reveal to you is how a single alcoholic beverage nearly destroyed French society, turning painters into killers, writers into madmen, and ordinary citizens into creatures of pure violence. We'll walk through the dark alleyways of Paris together, meet the victims and perpetrators of these horrific crimes, and uncover how the French government waged war against a bottle of green liquid that seemed to possess supernatural powers over the human mind. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how devastating this epidemic truly was. In 1910, France consumed 36 million litres of absinthe annually. That's enough to fill 14 Olympic swimming pools with pure liquid madness. The murder rate in Paris had tripled since the 1870s, and doctors were reporting unprecedented numbers of patients suffering from what they called absinthism, a condition that turned rational human beings into violent, hallucinating shells of their former selves. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about alcohol or addiction. It's about how an entire culture became intoxicated with self-destruction, how the pursuit of artistic inspiration led to societal collapse, and how the green fairy that promised to unlock creativity instead unlocked the darkest corners of the human psyche. Let me take you back to where it all began, in the smoky taverns of Montmartre, where artists gathered each evening to sip their ritual glass of the green goddess. The year was 1875, and Jean-Baptiste Tropman had just become the most notorious killer in French history, butchering an entire family of 8 in what newspapers called the crime of the century. But Tropman wasn't just any murderer. He was an absinthe drinker, and his case would become the first in a long line of horrific crimes linked to the Emerald Elixir. The Kink family massacre shocked Paris to its core. Jean Kink, a prosperous businessman, had trusted Tropman with his money and his life. Instead, Tropman lured the entire family to a remote field outside Paris, where he systematically murdered them one by one. The father, the mother, and 6 children, ranging in age from 16 down to just 2 years old, all fell victim to Tropman's absinthe-fueled rage. When police arrested Tropman, they found him in a stupor, reeking of absinthe, and completely unable to explain his actions. He claimed to remember nothing of the murders, insisting that the green fairy had taken control of his mind and transformed him into something inhuman. The newspapers seized on this detail, and suddenly all of Paris was talking about the mysterious connection between absinthe and violence. But Tropman was just the beginning. As absinthe consumption soared throughout the 1880s and 1890s, so did the body count. The pattern was always the same. Ordinary citizens would begin drinking absinthe regularly, slowly increasing their consumption until they reached what doctors called the threshold of madness. Then, seemingly without warning, they would explode into acts of unthinkable violence. Take the case of Henri Pranzini, the man who would become known as the Absinthe Ripper. Pranzini was a charming Italian immigrant who had come to Paris seeking his fortune. He was handsome, well-dressed, and spoke multiple languages fluently. Women adored him, men envied him, and society welcomed him with open arms. But Henri Pranzini had a secret addiction that would transform him from a gentleman into a monster. Every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, Pranzini would make his way to the Café de la Rotonde in Montparnasse, where he would begin his nightly ritual with the green fairy. 1 glass became 2, 2 became 3, and soon Pranzini was consuming nearly a bottle of absinthe each night. His friends noticed the changes immediately. His charming smile became a sinister grin, his smooth conversation turned to paranoid rambling, and his gentle manner gave way to sudden bursts of terrifying rage. The transformation reached its horrific climax on March 17, 1887, when Pranzini broke into the apartment of Marie Regnault, a wealthy widow who had rejected his romantic advances. What happened next would haunt Paris for decades. Pranzini didn't just kill Marie Regnault. He butchered her with a savagery that shocked even the most hardened police investigators. He slashed her throat so violently that he nearly decapitated her, then turned his rage on her elderly servant and young daughter, killing them with the same methodical brutality. When police found Pranzini the next morning, he was sitting calmly in a cafe, sipping absinthe and reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened. He showed no remorse, no emotion, no recognition of the horror he had committed just hours before. It was as if the Henri Pranzini, who had charmed Parisian society, had completely disappeared, replaced by something cold and inhuman. The trial of Henri Pranzini became a sensation throughout France, not just because of the gruesome nature of his crimes, but because of the defense his lawyers mounted. They argued that Pranzini was not responsible for his actions because he had been driven insane by absinthe consumption. They brought in medical experts who testified about the devastating effects of absinthe on the human brain, describing how the drink literally poisoned the mind and destroyed a person's ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Dr. Valentine Magnan, France's leading expert on mental illness, took the stand and delivered testimony that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. He explained absinthe contained a chemical called thujone, derived from wormwood, which attacked the nervous system like a slow-acting poison. Regular consumption, he said, led to what he termed absinthism, a condition characterized by hallucinations, violent outbursts, and complete moral degradation. The doctor described patients he had treated who began as normal, productive citizens but into madness through gradually descend absinthe consumption. They would see things that weren't there, hear voices commanding them to commit acts of violence, and lose all sense of human empathy. Most terrifying of all, they often retained enough of their intelligence to plan and execute complex crimes, but lost all moral restraint that would prevent them from carrying out their darkest impulses. But the prosecution wasn't convinced by this absinthe defense. They pointed out that millions of French citizens drank absinthe regularly without becoming murderers, and argued that Pranzini was simply using the popular drink as an excuse for his own evil nature. The debate raged for weeks, with newspapers taking sides and the public divided between those who saw absinthe as a dangerous poison and those who viewed it as a scapegoat for individual moral failings. The jury ultimately rejected the absinthe defense and sentenced Pranzini to death, but the damage was done. The trial had planted a seed of fear in the French consciousness about the green fairy that would only grow stronger with each passing year. Every violent crime, every domestic dispute disorder, every act of public was now scrutinized for connections to absinthe consumption, and the connections kept appearing. In 1888, just 1 year after the Pranzini trial, Pierre Véron murdered his wife and 3 children in their small apartment in Belleville. Neighbors reported hearing terrible screams throughout the night, but assumed it was just another domestic argument fueled by alcohol. When police broke down the door the next morning, they found a scene of unimaginable carnage. Véron had used a kitchen knife to systematically torture and kill his entire family, then attempted to burn down the building to cover his tracks. Véron was found 3 days later, wandering the streets of Paris in a complete daze, his clothes still stained with his family's blood. When questioned, He claimed to have no memory of the murders, insisting that evil spirits had possessed his body after he drank absinthe. He described vivid hallucinations of demons commanding him to kill, of his wife and children transforming into monsters before his eyes, of voices promising him eternal salvation if he would only eliminate the corruption in his home. The pattern was becoming undeniable, even to the most skeptical observers. Case after case revealed the same progression: regular absinthe consumption, gradual personality changes, escalating violence, and finally, explosive acts of murder, followed by complete amnesia or bizarre supernatural explanations. The Green Fairy was no longer just a drink. It had become a genuine threat to public safety. Dr. Magnan continued his research, documenting hundreds of cases of absinthe-related violence and madness. He identified specific stages of absinthism, from the initial euphoric phase, where users felt more creative and sociable, through the chronic phase, where hallucinations began and personality changes became apparent, to the final toxic phase, where users became capable of the most heinous acts imaginable. His findings painted a terrifying picture of a society slowly poisoning itself with liquid madness. He estimated that nearly 10% of regular absinthe drinkers would eventually progress to the toxic phase, meaning that hundreds of thousands of French citizens were walking time bombs, waiting for the right trigger to explode into violence. The medical community rallied behind Dr. Magnan's research, but the absinthe industry fought back with equal vigor. They funded their own studies claiming that absinthe was no more dangerous than wine or beer, and they hired prominent scientists to debunk the connection between their product and violent crime. They pointed out that correlation was not causation, and argued that violent individuals were simply drawn to stronger alcohol, not transformed by it. This scientific battle played out in newspapers and academic journals across France. But on the streets of Paris, the evidence kept mounting. The absinthe murders, as journalists had begun calling them, were occurring with frightening regularity. Each new case added another chapter to the growing mythology surrounding the Green Fairy, and each new chapter made the French public more terrified of the emerald liquid that had once symbolized artistic inspiration and bohemian freedom. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of French society. On one side stood the absinthe industry, the bohemian artists who had made the drink famous, and the libertarian philosophers who argued that the government had no right to regulate what citizens chose to drink. On the other side stood an increasingly vocal coalition of doctors, temperance advocates, and terrified citizens who demanded action to stop the Green Fairy's reign of terror. But before that battle could be fought, Paris would witness its most shocking absinthe murder yet, a crime so horrific and senseless that it would finally convince even the most ardent supporters of the Green Fairy that something had to be done. The case that would finally shatter France's tolerance for absinthe came on a foggy November morning in 1894, when police discovered what newspapers would later call the Montmartre Massacre. The perpetrator was Auguste Langlois, a 34-year-old clockmaker who had never committed so much as a petty theft in his entire life. His neighbors described him as quiet, dependable, and devoted to his craft. His wife Marie spoke of him as the gentlest man she had ever known, someone who couldn't bear to kill a spider, let alone harm another human being. But Auguste Langlois had been keeping a secret from his wife, his friends, and even himself. For 3 years, he had been visiting the Lapin Agile cabaret in Montmartre every evening after work, where he would sit alone in the corner and slowly consume glass after glass of absinthe. What had started as a single drink to calm his nerves after long days bent over tiny clock mechanisms had evolved into a nightly ritual of self-destruction. The transformation began subtly. Marie noticed that her husband had become more irritable, snapping at her over trivial matters and complaining about noises that she couldn't hear. He claimed that their neighbors were spying on him through the walls, that strangers on the street were following him home, that even the clocks in his workshop were conspiring against him. She attributed these concerns to work stress and encouraged him to take a vacation, never suspecting that her loving husband was slowly descending into absinthe-induced madness. The night of November 18th started like any other. Auguste finished his work, kissed his wife goodbye, and walked through the winding streets of Montmartre to his usual table at the Lapin Agile. But instead of his customary 3 or 4 glasses, Auguste consumed an entire bottle of absinthe, downing glass after glass, as if trying to drown something deep within his soul. Witnesses later testified that they had never seen anyone drink so much absinthe and remain conscious, let alone functional. At approximately midnight, Auguste left the cabaret and began walking through the narrow streets of Montmartre. But he wasn't walking home. According to his later confession, the absinthe had awakened something monstrous within him, filling his mind with visions of violence and whispers of destiny. He claimed that the green fairy herself had appeared before him, beautiful and terrible, commanding him to cleanse the world of corruption by eliminating anyone who crossed his path. His first victim was Claude Dubois, a street musician who was packing up his violin after a long evening of playing for coins. Auguste approached him with a friendly smile, complimented his music, then suddenly grabbed a cobblestone and smashed it into Claude's skull with such force that witnesses 3 blocks away heard the impact. Claude died instantly, his violin case spilling coins across the blood-soaked pavement. But Auguste wasn't finished. The taste of violence had awakened an insatiable hunger within him, and the absinthe had stripped away every moral barrier that might have stopped him from feeding that hunger. He moved through Montmartre like a predator, seeking out anyone unfortunate enough to be alone on the dark streets. His second victim was Marguerite Rousseau, a seamstress walking home from a late evening of work. Auguste strangled her with her own scarf, then carefully arranged her body in what he later described as an offering to the green goddess. The killing spree continued for nearly 3 hours, leaving a trail of bodies through the heart of Paris's artistic quarter. Auguste's victims included a baker closing his shop, 2 students from the École des Beaux-Arts who had been walking home after a night of drinking, an elderly priest who had been visiting a dying parishioner, and finally, most shockingly of all, a young mother who had been carrying her infant son home from her sister's house. What Auguste did to that mother and child was so horrific that newspapers refused to print the details, referring only to acts of unspeakable savagery that defied human comprehension. Police investigators who worked the crime scene required psychological counselling afterward, and several quit the force entirely rather than face the possibility of encountering similar atrocities in the future. Auguste's rampage finally ended when he encountered a group of off-duty gendarmes who were walking home after their own evening of drinking. Even in his absinthe-fueled state, he recognized that he was outnumbered, and something resembling sanity briefly returned to his mind. He dropped the bloodied cobblestone he had been carrying and began laughing hysterically, telling the officers that he had completed his sacred mission and was ready to face judgment for his service to the Green Fairy. When police searched Auguste's workshop the next day, they discovered a journal that provided terrifying insight into his gradual descent into absinthe madness. The early entries, dating back 3 years, were perfectly normal accounts of his daily routine and observations about his clockmaking work. But as the months progressed, the entries became increasingly paranoid and violent. He wrote about hearing voices emanating from his absinthe glass, about seeing demonic faces in the green liquid, about receiving divine commands to purify the world through bloodshed. The final entry, written just hours before his killing spree, was barely legible and filled with references to mythical creatures, supernatural powers, and his destined role as an agent of the Green Fairy's will. He described feeling transformed into something greater than human, possessed of strength beyond mortal limitations, and blessed with the clarity to see truth beyond the veil of ordinary existence. Dr. Magnan examined Auguste extensively during his trial, documenting his condition as the most severe case of absinthism he had ever encountered. Auguste's brain had been so thoroughly poisoned by years of absinthe consumption that he genuinely believed he had been chosen by supernatural forces to commit his crimes. He showed no remorse for his actions, no understanding of the pain he had caused, and no recognition that he had done anything wrong. In his mind, he was a hero who had sacrificed his own soul to serve a higher purpose. The trial became a national sensation, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse every day to catch a glimpse of the man who had terrorized Paris. Auguste's defense attorney attempted to use the same absinthe defense that had failed in the Pranzini case, but the sheer magnitude of Auguste's crimes made it impossible for the jury to show mercy. They deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts, sentencing Auguste to death by guillotine. But the real impact of the Langlois case wasn't his execution. It was the wave of public outrage that followed his arrest. For the first time, ordinary French citizens began demanding government action against absinthe. Mothers organized protests outside cabarets that served the drink. Workers' unions called for bans on absinthe sales near factories and workshops, and even artists who had once celebrated the Green Fairy began questioning whether their beloved drink was worth the price in human lives. The Catholic Church, which had remained largely neutral in the absinthe debate, finally took a stand after Auguste murdered the priest. Cardinal François-Marie Benjamin Richard delivered a sermon at Notre Dame Cathedral that was reprinted in newspapers across France, declaring absinthe to be the devil's own elixir, designed to corrupt the souls of good Christians and turn them into instruments of evil. He called upon all faithful Catholics to renounce the drink and to pressure their government representatives to ban its sale and production. Politicians who had previously avoided taking sides in the absinthe controversy suddenly found themselves facing intense pressure from their constituents. Deputy Georges Perrin of the Chamber of Deputies introduced the first serious legislation aimed at restricting absinthe sales, proposing heavy taxes on the drink and regulations that would make it much more difficult to obtain. His bill gained support from representatives across the political spectrum, united by their shared fear of creating more monsters like Auguste Langlois. The absinthe industry realized that their product was facing an existential threat and launched the most expensive lobbying campaign in French history up to that point. They hired former government ministers, prominent lawyers, and influential journalists to argue their case. They funded medical studies that challenged Dr. Magnan's research, sponsored artists who testified about absinthe's role in inspiring great works of art, and even organized public tastings designed to show that absinthe could be consumed safely, in moderation. But their most effective strategy was to argue that banning absinthe would destroy French culture itself. They pointed out that the drink had become synonymous with Parisian artistic life, that visitors from around the world came to France specifically to experience the bohemian lifestyle that absinthe represented. They claimed that eliminating absinthe would drive away tourists, bankrupt thousands of cafes and cabarets, and rob France of its reputation as the world's cultural capital. This argument resonated with many French citizens who took pride in their nation's artistic achievements and worried about the economic consequences of prohibition. The country found itself torn between fear of absinthe's destructive power and love of the culture that had grown up around it. Cafe owners reported that absinthe sales had actually increased following the Langlois case, as curious citizens wanted to experience the drink that had caused so much controversy before it potentially disappeared forever. The debate raged in newspapers, academic journals, and political assemblies throughout 1895 and 1896. Medical experts presented increasingly sophisticated research about absinthe's effects on the human brain, while industry representatives countered with their own studies and economic arguments. Artists organized exhibitions celebrating absinthe's role in French culture, while temperance advocates held rallies demanding immediate prohibition. But even as politicians debated and experts argued, The Absinthe murders continued. The Langlois case had been so shocking that it overshadowed other absinthe-related crimes, but they kept occurring with depressing regularity. Police files from this period document dozens of cases where absinthe consumption appeared to be a contributing factor in violent crimes, from domestic murders to random street attacks to elaborate schemes of revenge and mayhem. Each new case added fuel to the prohibitionist fire, but also strengthened the resolve of absinthe defenders who argued that these were isolated incidents being blown out of proportion by moral crusaders and sensationalist journalists. The battle lines were drawn, and neither side seemed willing to compromise. France was heading toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of absinthe, but the very soul of French society. The Green Fairy had become more than just a drink. It had evolved into a symbol of the fundamental tension between individual freedom and public safety, between artistic expression and social responsibility, between the pursuit of transcendence and the demands of ordinary morality. The question was no longer simply whether absinthe should be banned, but what kind of society France wanted to become in the new century that was rapidly approaching. The answer to that question would come sooner than anyone expected, delivered by a crime so horrific that it would finally unite all of France against the Green Fairy. But to understand the full impact of what was about to unfold, you need to know about the man who would become the most infamous absinthe murderer in French history. Jean-Baptiste Tropman's spiritual successor, a killer whose name would be whispered in terror throughout Paris for generations to come. His name was Émile Zola, not the famous novelist, but a baker's apprentice from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine who shared nothing with his namesake except a talent for capturing the darkest aspects of human nature. But where the writer used words to explore the depths of human depravity, this Émile Zola would use a butcher's knife to paint his masterpiece in blood across the streets of Paris. Émile was 26 years old in the spring of 1897, a quiet young man who had worked for the same bakery since he was 14. His employer, Monsieur Beaumont, described him as the most reliable worker he had ever hired. Émile arrived before dawn every morning, kneaded dough with mechanical precision, and never missed a day of work in 12 years. His fellow bakers respected his skill, customers appreciated his polite manner, and his landlady considered him the perfect tenant. But Émile Zola harbored a secret that would have terrified anyone who knew him. Every evening after work, he would walk to the Café de l'Amour in Belleville, where he would sit alone at a corner table and drink absinthe until the establishment closed. He had discovered the Green Fairy 3 years earlier, initially drawn by curiosity about the drink that had become so controversial. That first sip had revealed a world of sensation and possibility that his mundane existence had never offered. The transformation began gradually, as it always did with absinthe. Émile found that the drink enhanced his senses, making colours more vivid, sounds more musical, and emotions more intense. He began to see patterns in the bakery's routine that he had never noticed before, connections between customers that suggested hidden relationships and secret conspiracies. The Green Fairy was opening his eyes to truths that ordinary people couldn't perceive. As his consumption increased, so did the clarity of these revelations. Émile began to understand that he was not just a baker's apprentice, but a chosen instrument of divine justice. The absinthe showed him visions of corruption and evil that infected every level of Parisian society. From the wealthy bourgeoisie who exploited the poor to the politicians who sold their souls for power. He alone could see through the facades and pretenses that fooled everyone else. The voices started in his 4th year of regular absinthe consumption. At first, they were whispers that he could barely distinguish from his own thoughts. But as the months passed, they became clearer and more insistent. The Green Fairy herself began speaking to him directly, explaining his sacred mission and preparing him for the great work that lay ahead. She told him that Paris was infected with a spiritual disease that could only be cured through blood and fire. By the summer of 1897, Émile was consuming nearly 2 bottles of absinthe each night, spending every franc he earned on the green elixir that had become more important to him than food or shelter. His appearance began to deteriorate as the poison worked its way through his system. His skin took on a yellowish pallor, his hands developed a constant tremor, and his eyes acquired the glassy stare that experienced observers had learned to associate with advanced absinthism. Monsieur Beaumont noticed the changes, but attributed them to overwork and summer heat. He had no idea that his trusted employee was slowly transforming into something inhuman, that the gentle young man who shaped bread each morning was planning acts of violence that would surpass even Auguste Langlois in their savagery. The Green Fairy had chosen Emile for a special purpose, and she was preparing him carefully for the night when he would finally fulfill his destiny. That night came on August 15th, 1897, the feast of the Assumption of Mary. Emile had spent the entire day in a state of supernatural clarity, seeing signs and omens everywhere he looked. The bread dough revealed prophetic patterns, customer conversations, contained hidden messages, and even the arrangement of coins in his pocket seemed to spell out divine commands. By evening, he knew that the time had come to begin his holy work. He consumed 3 full bottles of absinthe that night, more than any human being should have been able to survive. But the Green Fairy protected her chosen servant, filling him with strength beyond mortal limitations and vision beyond human comprehension. When the café closed at 2 a.m, Emile walked into the streets of Paris carrying a leather satchel filled with the tools of his trade: bread knives, meat cleavers, and pastry cutters that would serve a very different purpose than their creators had intended. His first target was the Rousseau family, wealthy merchants who lived in a mansion near the Place des Vosges. Emile had delivered bread to their kitchen for years, observing their decadent lifestyle and corrupt values. The Green Fairy had shown him visions of their true nature: parasites who fed on the misery of the poor while pretending to be respectable citizens. Tonight, he would expose their corruption for all the world to see. Breaking into the mansion required skills that Emile had never possessed in his normal state, but the absinthe had transformed him into something far more capable than an ordinary baker. He moved through the house like a shadow, avoiding servants and security measures with supernatural grace. The Green Fairy guided his steps, whispering directions and warnings that kept him hidden until he reached the family's bedchambers. What Emile did to the Rousseau family that night defied every standard of human decency. He didn't simply kill them. He transformed them into works of art that expressed his absinthe-inspired vision of divine justice. Each family member was arranged in elaborate tableaux that told the story of their moral corruption. Their bodies positioned and mutilated in ways that would have been impossible for anyone but a skilled craftsman to achieve. The father, whom Emile had identified as the source of the family's evil, was found in his study with his account books arranged around him like a shrine to greed. His wife, guilty of vanity and pride, was discovered in front of her mirror with her jewelry embedded in her flesh, like grotesque decorations. Their 3 children, innocent but tainted by their parents' sins, were arranged in their nursery in poses that suggested both sleep and death, their faces peaceful, despite the violence that had been done to their small bodies. But Emile's masterpiece was yet to come. He spent the remaining hours before dawn transforming the mansion's dining room into a cathedral of carnage, using the family's blood to paint elaborate murals on the walls that depicted scenes from his absinthe-fueled visions. He created altars from furniture and corpses, arranged religious symbols made from human organs, and wrote lengthy passages of prophetic text using techniques he had learned from decorating wedding cakes. When the servants discovered the scene the next morning, several of them suffered complete mental breakdowns that required immediate hospitalization. The police inspector who responded to the call, a veteran of 20 years who had seen every form of human violence, took one look at Emile's handiwork and immediately submitted his resignation. The crime scene was so disturbing that authorities decided to burn the mansion rather than attempt to clean it, declaring the building uninhabitable due to spiritual contamination. Emile was found 3 days later, sitting calmly in his usual chair at the Café de la Mort, sketching elaborate diagrams of his next artistic project. He offered no resistance when police arrested him, explaining patiently that his work was not yet complete, but that he was willing to discuss his methods with anyone interested in understanding true art. He described the Rousseau murders in loving detail, comparing them to the greatest masterpieces in the Louvre, and expressing disappointment that so few people appreciated the spiritual significance of what he had accomplished. Dr. Magnan examined Émile extensively, documenting his condition as the most complete case of absinthe psychosis ever recorded. The baker's brain had been so thoroughly poisoned that he had lost all connection to objective reality, existing instead in a world of supernatural visions and divine commands that bore no relationship to the actual world around him. He genuinely believed that he was an artist chosen by God to purify humanity through violence, and no amount of evidence or argument could penetrate the delusions that the Green Fairy had created. The trial of Émile Zola became an international sensation, drawing observers from across Europe and America who wanted to witness the proceedings firsthand. Newspapers published daily transcripts of the testimony, and crowds gathered in the streets outside the courthouse to catch glimpses of the man who had shocked the world with his absinthe-fueled artistry. The case became a symbol of everything that was wrong with modern French society, proof that the pursuit of decadence and pleasure had led to the complete breakdown of moral order. The prosecution presented Émile's case as the inevitable result of a society that had allowed poison to be sold as entertainment. They brought in dozens of witnesses who testified about the devastating effects of absinthe on French culture, from the artists who had abandoned their families to chase green fairy visions, to the workers who had lost their jobs due to absinthe-related absences. They painted a picture of a nation slowly destroying itself through collective addiction to liquid madness. The defense attempted to argue that Émile was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions, but this strategy backfired spectacularly when Émile himself took the stand. He spoke for 6 hours without interruption, describing his crimes in such loving detail and with such obvious pride that even his own lawyers began to question their client's humanity. He explained his artistic philosophy, demonstrated his techniques using courtroom furniture as props, and offered to create new masterpieces for anyone willing to provide him with appropriate materials. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Émile to death, but added an unusual statement to the proceedings. He declared that Émile Zola represented the ultimate expression of absinthe's corrupting influence on the human soul, and called upon the French government to take immediate action to prevent the creation of more such monsters. That judicial statement would prove to be the tipping point in France's relationship with absinthe. Within hours of the verdict, protests erupted across Paris demanding immediate prohibition of the Green Fairy. Unlike previous demonstrations that had been organized by temperance societies and religious groups, these protests included ordinary citizens from every walk of life. Shopkeepers closed their businesses to march in the streets. Factory workers organized strikes that included demands for absinthe prohibition, and even artists who had once celebrated the drink began publicly renouncing their former patron. The Catholic Church organized a national day of prayer for the souls of absinthe victims, while Protestant ministers delivered sermons comparing the Green Fairy to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Medical associations issued joint statements calling for emergency legislation to protect public health, and police unions demanded additional resources to deal with the continuing wave of absinthe-related violence. Politicians who had previously supported the absinthe industry found themselves facing furious constituents who demanded immediate action. Deputy Perrin's anti-absinthe legislation, which had been stalled in committee for 2 years, was suddenly fast-tracked for a full vote. New bills were introduced calling for even stricter measures, including complete prohibition of absinthe production and sales throughout the French Republic. The absinthe industry launched a desperate counteroffensive, spending enormous sums on newspaper advertisements that claimed Émile Zola was an isolated case of individual madness rather than a product of their product. They hired prominent scientists to challenge the medical evidence against absinthe, sponsored cultural events celebrating the drink's role in French artistic achievement, and organised their own protests featuring famous artists and writers who credited absinthe with inspiring their greatest works. But their efforts were overwhelmed by the sheer horror of what Émile had done to the Rousseau family. The crime scene photographs, which had been leaked to sensationalist newspapers despite official attempts at suppression, showed the French public exactly what absinthe could do to a human mind. The images were so disturbing that several publications were prosecuted for obscenity, but the damage was done. Every French citizen had seen the Green Fairy's ultimate masterpiece, and they wanted nothing more to do with the drink that had made it possible. The scientific community rallied behind Dr. Magnan's research with unprecedented unity. Medical schools across France began teaching courses on absinthism, hospitals established special wards for treating absinthe addiction, and research institutes launched comprehensive studies of the drink's effects on human physiology and psychology. The evidence was overwhelming. Absinthe was not just another alcoholic beverage, but a genuine poison that attacked the human nervous system and destroyed the moral faculties that separated civilization from barbarism. International observers began paying close attention to France's absinthe crisis, recognizing that their own countries might face similar problems if the drink's popularity continued to spread. Swiss medical authorities reported increasing numbers of absinthe-related incidents near their border with France, while Belgian police documented several violent crimes that appeared to follow the same pattern as the French cases. The Green Fairy was not just a French problem, it was a threat to European civilization itself. The momentum for prohibition became unstoppable after a series of copycat crimes inspired by Émile Zola's example. 3 separate incidents in the autumn of 1897 involved absinthe drinkers who attempted to recreate Émile's artistic approach to murder, though none achieved his level of elaborate brutality. The mere fact that people were trying to imitate his crimes proved that the Green Fairy had created a new form of madness that threatened to spread like a contagion through French society. Religious leaders who had previously disagreed on almost every political issue found common ground in their opposition to absinthe. Cardinal Richard organised an unprecedented ecumenical conference that brought together Catholic bishops, Protestant ministers, and Jewish rabbis in a united call for prohibition. Their joint statement declared absinthe to be an affront to all faiths and a threat to the divine spark that exists within every human soul. Even the artistic community, which had been absinthe's most loyal constituency, began to turn against their former muse. The Académie Française issued a formal statement condemning absinthe as a false inspiration that leads to degradation rather than elevation of the human spirit. Famous painters publicly destroyed works they had created under absinthe's influence, while poets and writers organized readings of sober literature designed to demonstrate that true art required clarity of mind rather than chemical enhancement. The economic arguments that had previously protected absinthe began to crumble as the social costs of the drink became impossible to ignore. Insurance companies started refusing to cover absinthe-related damages. Banks stopped lending money to businesses that sold the drink, and foreign investors began withdrawing capital from French enterprises associated with absinthe production or distribution. The Green Fairy, once seen as a symbol of French cultural sophistication, had become a liability that threatened the nation's economic stability. Labour unions, which had initially opposed absinthe prohibition as an attack on workers' rights, reversed their position after documenting the devastating effects of absinthe addiction on their membership. Factory owners reported that absinthe drinking employees were far more likely to suffer industrial accidents, miss work due to illness, or engage in violent confrontations with supervisors and co-workers. The drink that had once provided escape from industrial monotony had become a threat to industrial safety and productivity. By the end of 1897, France found itself facing a crisis that went far beyond simple public health concerns. The absinthe epidemic had revealed fundamental weaknesses in French society: the isolation of urban workers from traditional communities, the erosion of religious faith among the educated classes, the glorification of decadence and excess as expressions of artistic sophistication. The Green Fairy had not created these problems, but it had certainly exploited and amplified them in ways that threatened the very foundation of French civilization. The stage was set for a final confrontation between the forces of prohibition and the defenders of absinthe. Politicians prepared for legislative battles that would determine the future of French culture, while police and medical authorities braced for the possibility of even more horrific crimes as absinthe drinkers realized that their beloved poison might soon be taken away from them. The Green Fairy had transformed France into a battlefield, and the outcome of that battle would determine whether the nation could save itself from the madness that had already claimed so many victims. But even as the prohibition movement gained momentum, absinthe consumption continued to rise throughout France. Desperate addicts stockpiled bottles against the possibility of future shortages, while curious citizens rushed to experience the legendary drink before it disappeared forever. The very controversy that was destroying absinthe's reputation was also driving unprecedented demand for the product, creating a perverse situation where the Green Fairy's approaching doom only increased its power over the French imagination. The final act of this tragic drama was about to begin, and no one could predict whether France would emerge from the struggle with its soul intact, or whether the Green Fairy would claim one last devastating victory before finally releasing her hold on the City of Light. The answer to France's desperate question came in the form of legislation that would forever change the relationship between the French government and its citizens. On December 3rd, 1897, Deputy Georges Perrin stood before the Chamber of Deputies and delivered what many historians consider the most passionate speech in French parliamentary history. His words would echo through the halls of power and ultimately seal the fate of the Green Fairy. "Gentlemen," Perrin declared, his voice trembling with emotion, "we stand at a crossroads between civilization and chaos. The green poison that flows through our cafes has transformed our beloved Paris into a charnel house of broken minds and shattered souls. How many more families must be iced on the altar of this liquid madness before we find the courage to act?" Perrin had personal reasons for his crusade against absinthe. His own brother, Marcel, had been a promising violinist at the Paris Conservatory until the Green Fairy claimed him. Marcel's descent into absinthism had been swift and devastating. Within 6 months of his first taste of absinthe, he had abandoned his musical studies, sold his precious violin for drinking money, and begun exhibiting the violent mood swings that characterized advanced absinthism. The breaking point came when Marcel attacked his music teacher with a broken bottle, claiming that the elderly part man was of a conspiracy to steal his compositions. Marcel spent 3 months in the Salpêtrière hospital, where Dr. Magnan documented his case as a textbook example of absinthe-induced psychosis. When Marcel was finally released, he was a hollow shell of his former self, capable of little more than mumbling incoherently about green fairies and stolen melodies. Deputy Perrin's speech lasted for 3 hours, during which he detailed case after case of absinthe-related destruction. He spoke of Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a respected banker who had embezzled nearly 1 million francs to fund his absinthe addiction before attempting to murder his wife when she threatened to expose his crimes. He described the fate of Sister Marie Catherine, a nun who had been secretly drinking absinthe, and eventually attacked her Mother Superior with a crucifix, claiming that God had commanded her to purify the corrupt. The chamber listened in stunned silence as Perrin recounted the story of the Dubois children, 3 young siblings who had discovered their father's hidden stash of absinthe and consumed enough to poison themselves. The youngest, little Marie, was only 7 years old when she died in agony, her small body convulsing as the foujon destroyed her developing nervous system. Her final words, according to the attending physician, were a request for the pretty green lady to take away her pain. "Every day we delay action," Perrin continued, his voice rising to fill the chamber. "We condemn more innocence to madness and death. The green fairy promises inspiration, but delivers only destruction. She whispers of creativity, but speaks only lies. We have the power to silence her forever, and by God, we must find the courage to use it." The opposition's response was led by Deputy Henri Rochefort, a brilliant orator who had been hired by the absinthe industry to defend their interests. Rochefort was a master of rhetorical manipulation, capable of making even the most obvious truths seem questionable through clever wordplay and emotional appeals. He stood before the chamber like a gladiator entering the arena, confident in his ability to defeat any argument through sheer intellectual superiority. "My esteemed colleague would have us believe," Rochefort began with a sardonic smile, "that a simple beverage possesses supernatural powers to corrupt the human soul. This is not legislation, a stition. This is sup is not governance. This is hysteria. Are we to ban wine because some men become violent when drunk? Shall we prohibit bread because some bakers go mad? The logic of prohibition leads inevitably to tyranny." Rochefort's strategy was to shift the debate from public health to individual liberty, portraying absinthe prohibition as an attack on the fundamental rights of French citizens. He spoke eloquently about the cafés of Montmartre, where artists gathered to share ideas and create the works that made France the cultural capital of the world. He painted romantic pictures of bohemian life, where absinthe served as a catalyst for genius and a lubricant for intellectual discourse. Toulouse-Lautrec creates his masterpieces with absinthe at his elbow, Rochefort declared dramatically. Verlaine composes his immortal verses under the green fairy's influence. Degas captures the essence of Parisian life while sipping the emerald elixir. Would you destroy French art to satisfy the paranoid fantasies of a few medical extremists? But Rochefort's eloquence could not overcome the mounting evidence of absinthe's destructive power. Deputy after deputy rose to share their own stories of constituents destroyed by the green fairy. They spoke of workers who had lost their jobs due to absinthe-related violence, of families torn apart by addiction, of children orphaned by absinthe-fueled murders. Deputy Louis Barthou, representing the industrial city of Pau, described how absinthe had nearly destroyed the local textile industry. Workers who had once been models of reliability and skill began missing shifts, fighting with supervisors, and operating dangerous machinery while under the influence of residual absinthe toxins. 3 separate factory fires had been traced to absinthe-impaired employees, resulting in millions of francs in damages and dozens of injuries. The testimony that finally broke Rochefort's defense came from an unexpected source. Dr. Auguste Mottet, France's leading expert on criminal psychology. Dr. Mottet had spent 5 years studying violent criminals in French prisons, and his findings were devastating to the absinthe industry's case. Of the 847 murderers he had examined, 623 were regular absinthe drinkers. Of those 623, an astounding 89% showed clear signs of absinthism-related brain damage. Dr. Mottet's most chilling revelation concerned the nature of absinthe-related violence. Unlike crimes committed under the influence of wine or beer, which were typically spontaneous acts of passion, absinthe murders showed clear evidence of planning and deliberation. The green fairy didn't just remove moral inhibitions, it actively encouraged elaborate fantasies of violence and revenge. Absinthe drinkers didn't just lose control. They gained a twisted form of focus that allowed them to carry out increasingly sophisticated acts of brutality. Gentlemen, Dr. Mottet concluded, absinthe does not simply make men violent, it makes them creatively violent. It transforms ordinary citizens into artists of destruction, capable of conceiving and executing acts of cruelty that would be impossible for a sane mind to imagine. We are not dealing with mere intoxication. We are confronting a form of chemical possession that turns human beings into instruments of pure evil. The chamber erupted in chaos as deputies shouted their support for immediate prohibition. Rochefort attempted to continue his defense, but his words were drowned out by the overwhelming chorus of voices demanding action. The Green Fairy's most articulate defender had been silenced by the weight of scientific evidence and human testimony. The vote, when it finally came, was a foregone conclusion. The Absinthe Prohibition Act, passed by a margin of 441 to 32, with even many deputies who had previously supported the industry switching sides at the last moment. The law would take effect on January 1st, 1898, giving producers and distributors exactly 4 weeks to dispose of their remaining inventory. But the absinthe industry was not prepared to surrender without a fight. Within hours of the parliamentary vote, they filed legal challenges in every French court, arguing that the prohibition violated constitutional protections of commerce and individual liberty. They organised massive protests in Paris and other major cities, featuring prominent artists and intellectuals who spoke passionately about the cultural importance of absinthe. The most dramatic of these protests occurred on December 15th, when nearly 10,000 absinthe supporters gathered in the Place de la Bastille for what they called the Last Supper of the Green Fairy. The demonstration was organised by a collective of Montmartre artists, led by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who had become the unofficial spokesman for absinthe's cultural defenders. Toulouse-Lautrec, despite his physical disabilities, delivered deteriorating health at a speech that captured the romantic mythology surrounding absinthe. He spoke of the drink as a divine gift that allowed ordinary mortals to glimpse the infinite, a chemical key that unlocked the doors of perception and revealed hidden truths about the nature of existence. He portrayed the prohibition as an act of cultural vandalism that would rob France of its artistic soul and reduce its creators to mere craftsmen. They would steal our inspiration, Toulouse-Lautrec declared from his wheelchair, his voice carrying across the crowded square, and leave us with nothing but mundane reality. They would close the doors that absinthe opens and trap us forever in the prison of ordinary consciousness. But we who have danced with the Green Fairy know that there are worlds beyond this world, visions beyond this vision, truths beyond their petty truths. Ah! The crowd responded with thunderous applause, but their enthusiasm could not change the fundamental fact that French society had turned against absinthe. Even as artists proclaimed their loyalty to the Green Fairy, ordinary citizens were celebrating her approaching exile. Cafes began advertising absinthe-free zones. Churches held special services thanking God for delivering France from the green poison, and medical schools reported record enrollment in courses on treating absinthe addiction. The final weeks of 1897 witnessed scenes that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Desperate absinthe addicts roamed the streets of Paris, offering incredible sums for bottles of the increasingly scarce liquid. Black market dealers emerged overnight, charging prices that reflected absinthe's transformation from common beverage to forbidden treasure. Some addicts resorted to drinking industrial absinthe intended for cleaning purposes, resulting in a wave of poisoning cases that overwhelmed Parisian hospitals. The most tragic case involved Marguerite Dufour, a seamstress who had become addicted to absinthe after using it to cope with the death of her infant daughter. When legitimate sources dried up, Marguerite began drinking a toxic substitute made from wood alcohol and artificial colouring. The counterfeit absinthe destroyed her eyesight within days, but she continued drinking it until the poison stopped her heart. She was found dead in her tiny apartment, clutching an empty bottle and surrounded by the green dresses she had been sewing for customers who would never receive them. Dr. Magnan documented hundreds of similar cases during the final month of legal absinthe availability. His hospital became a refuge for addicts attempting to break their dependence on the Green Fairy before prohibition made their habit both illegal and impossibly expensive. The withdrawal process was horrific to witness, with patients experiencing violent seizures, terrifying hallucinations, and complete psychological breakdowns as their poisoned brains struggled to function without their chemical crutch. One patient, a former philosophy professor named Claude Bernhardt, spent 3 weeks screaming about invisible demons that were trying to steal his memories. Another, a young artist named Sylvie Moreau, became convinced that her hands had been replaced by spiders and refused to eat or drink anything for 6 days. The lucky ones simply fell into catatonic states and had to be fed through tubes until their nervous systems slowly began to recover. But even as the medical evidence mounted and the human cost became undeniable, Absinthe's defenders continued their desperate campaign. They organized letter-writing campaigns to foreign governments, hoping that international pressure might force France to reconsider the prohibition. They funded expeditions to Switzerland and Belgium, seeking scientific evidence that might contradict Dr. Magnan's research. They even approached the Vatican, arguing that banning absinthe would interfere with the Catholic doctrine of free will. These efforts were undermined by a final, devastating blow to absinthe's reputation. On December 28th, just 4 days before prohibition was scheduled to take effect, Paris experienced what newspapers called the Night of Green Terror. 7 separate absinthe-related murders occurred within a 12-hour period, as desperate addicts attempted to obtain final supplies of their beloved poison. The most shocking incident involved François Dubois, a mild-mannered librarian who had never committed so much as a parking violation. François had been secretly drinking absinthe for 2 years, carefully hiding his addiction from his wife and colleagues. When he learned that prohibition was imminent, something snapped in his absinthe-damaged mind. He broke into a liquor warehouse, killed the night watchman with a crowbar, and barricaded himself inside with nearly 200 bottles of absinthe. Police surrounded the warehouse, but François refused to surrender. Instead, he began drinking bottle after bottle of absinthe, while shouting challenges at the officers outside. Witnesses described his voice changing throughout the night, becoming deeper and more menacing as the poison accumulated in his system. By dawn, he no longer sounded human at all, roaring like a wild animal and speaking in languages that linguistic experts later identified as complete gibberish. The siege ended when François, consumed by absinthe-induced paranoia, set fire to the warehouse rather than allow the police to capture his precious hoard. The explosion could be heard throughout Paris, and the green flames that erupted from the building seemed to symbolize the final victory of the Green Fairy over one of her most devoted servants. François' body was never recovered. Investigators found only a few charred bones and the melted remains of hundreds of absinthe bottles. The Night of Green Terror provided the final proof that French society needed. Even the most ardent supporters of absinthe could no longer deny that the drink had become a genuine threat to public safety. The remaining legal challenges were withdrawn, the protests ended, and the countdown to prohibition proceeded without further interference. On the evening of December 31st, 1897, thousands of Parisians gathered in cafes throughout the city for what they called the Green Fairy's funeral. These final absinthe ceremonies were both celebrations and wakes, as French society simultaneously mourned the loss of a cultural icon and celebrated its liberation from a chemical tyrant. The atmosphere was strange and surreal, with participants alternately laughing and crying as they raised their final glasses of legal absinthe. At the stroke of midnight, church bells throughout Paris tolled the death of the Green Fairy. Police officers entered cafes and cabarets, confiscating remaining bottles of absinthe and arresting anyone who attempted to serve or consume the newly illegal substance. The Belle Époque's most famous beverage had officially become contraband, transformed overnight from symbol of sophistication to mark of criminality. The immediate effects of prohibition were dramatic and largely positive. The murder rate in Paris dropped by 60% within the first month, as absinthe-related violence virtually disappeared overnight. Hospital admissions for psychiatric emergencies fell by similar amounts, and industrial accidents declined as workers no longer operated machinery while suffering from absinthe-induced hallucinations. The Green Fairy's reign of terror had finally ended. But prohibition also created new problems that would plague French society for decades. A thriving black market emerged immediately, controlled by criminal organizations that had previously focused on less lucrative enterprises. The price of illegal absinthe skyrocketed, leading desperate addicts to commit increasingly serious crimes to fund their habits. Police resources were diverted from other duties to enforce the absinthe prohibition, creating opportunities for other forms of criminal activity to flourish. The cultural impact was equally complex. Many artists genuinely struggled to create without their chemical muse, leading to a temporary decline in French artistic output that critics called the Grey Period. Some painters abandoned their careers entirely, while others fled to countries where absinthe remained legal. The famous cafés of Montmartre lost much of their bohemian atmosphere as artists and intellectuals scattered to seek inspiration elsewhere. However, the prohibition also sparked a renaissance of sober creativity that produced some of France's greatest cultural achievements. Artists who had relied on absinthe for inspiration were forced to develop new techniques and explore different sources of creative energy. Many discovered that their natural talents were far greater than they had realized, having been suppressed rather than enhanced by chemical stimulation. The medical community celebrated prohibition as one of the greatest public health victories in human history. Dr. Magnan established specialized clinics throughout France to treat absinthe addiction, developing therapeutic techniques that would later be applied to other forms of substance abuse. His research on the neurological effects of absinthe became the foundation for modern understanding of how toxic substances affect brain function and behavior. Religious leaders praised prohibition as evidence that French society had chosen virtue over vice, civilization over barbarism. The Catholic Church organized massive Thanksgiving services, while Protestant ministers preached sermons about the triumph of moral courage over commercial interests. Even secular philosophers argued that prohibition demonstrated humanity's capacity for rational self-governance in the face of destructive impulses. But perhaps the most significant impact of absinthe prohibition was its effect on French national identity. The country had confronted one of its darkest impulses and emerged stronger for the struggle. The Green Fairy had tested French civilization and found it capable of choosing collective welfare over individual pleasure, public safety over private profit. The Belle Époque would continue for another 17 years, but it would be a more sober and reflective era than the one that had preceded the absinthe crisis. The international community watched France's prohibition experiment with great interest, as many other countries were beginning to experience their own problems with absinthe consumption. Switzerland, Belgium, and the United States all implemented similar bans within 5 years, following France's example and learning from its experiences. The Green Fairy's influence spread far beyond French borders, but so did the knowledge of how to combat her destructive power. Yet even as prohibition succeeded in its immediate goals, questions remained about the deeper causes of the absinthe epidemic. Why had so many French citizens been drawn to a drink that promised inspiration but delivered madness? What social and cultural factors had made an entire society vulnerable to chemical seduction? These questions would continue to haunt French intellectuals and policymakers long after the last bottle of legal absinthe had been consumed. The answers lay partly in the rapid social changes that had transformed France during the 19th century. Industrialization had uprooted millions of people from traditional rural communities, leaving them isolated and alienated in growing cities. The decline of religious faith had created a spiritual vacuum that secular ideologies struggled to fill. The celebration of artistic rebellion had elevated individual expression above social responsibility, creating a culture that valued innovation over stability. Absinthe had not created these problems, but it had certainly exploited them. The Green Fairy offered escape from industrial monotony, transcendence without religious commitment, and creativity without discipline or sacrifice. For a society struggling with modernity's discontents, absinthe seemed to provide easy answers to difficult questions. Only after paying an enormous price in blood and madness did France learn that some shortcuts lead only to destruction. The lessons of the Absinthe crisis would prove prophetic for the challenges that lay ahead. Within 2 decades, France would face the unprecedented trauma of World War I, which would test the nation's resilience in ways that the Green Fairy never could. The experience of confronting and defeating the absinthe epidemic provided valuable preparation for that greater trial, demonstrating that French society possessed the moral courage and collective wisdom necessary to survive even the darkest chapters of its history. But in January of 1898, as Paris slowly recovered from its long intoxication with liquid madness, few people were thinking about future wars or distant challenges. They were simply grateful to wake up in a city where the Green Fairy no longer held sway, where madness was once again recognized as a disease rather than celebrated as inspiration, and where the pursuit of happiness did not require the sacrifice of sanity itself. The Belle Époque would continue, but it would be a different kind of golden age, one built on genuine achievement rather than chemical illusion, sustained by authentic creativity rather than artificial stimulation. The Green Fairy had taught France a hard lesson about the price of false transcendence, and that lesson would serve the nation well in the trials that were yet to come. The story might have ended there, with France's triumphant victory over the Green Fairy. But the Absinthe crisis had one final devastating chapter that would shake the very foundations of French society. Even as authorities celebrated their success in banishing the emerald poison, a new horror was emerging from the shadows of prohibition, one that would prove even more terrifying than anything that had come before. His name was Dr. Philippe Moreau, and he represented everything that French society admired about modern medicine. At 42 years old, he was the chief physician at the Hôpital Saint-Louis, a respected member of the Academy of Medicine, and one of the most vocal supporters of absinthe prohibition. His research on the neurological effects of chronic absinthe consumption had provided crucial evidence for the legislative campaign, and his testimony before the Chamber of Deputies had helped secure the final votes needed for the ban. Dr. Moreau had built his reputation by treating some of the most severe cases of absinthism in Paris. His patients included artists who had lost their ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination, workers who had become violent toward their own families, and intellectuals who had descended into complete madness. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of the Green Fairy, and his clinical observations had contributed to the scientific understanding of how absinthe destroyed human minds. But Dr. Moreau harbored a secret that would have destroyed his career and reputation if anyone had discovered it. For the past 3 years, while publicly campaigning against absinthe, he had been conducting private experiments on himself with increasingly concentrated forms of the forbidden substance. His medical training had convinced him that absinthe's effects could be controlled and channeled through proper scientific methodology, that the chaos and violence associated with the drink resulted from ignorant misuse rather than inherent toxicity. Dr. Moreau's descent into this dangerous research had begun innocently enough. As a physician treating absinthe addiction, he believed that understanding the substance's effects on his own mind would make him a more effective healer. He started with tiny doses, carefully measured and precisely timed, recording his observations in detailed journals that documented every aspect of his experience. The initial results seemed to confirm his hypothesis that absinthe could be safely managed through scientific discipline. The early experiments produced exactly the effects that Dr. Moreau had hoped to achieve. Small amounts of absinthe enhanced his concentration during long surgical procedures, sharpened his diagnostic abilities when examining difficult cases, and provided creative insights that helped him develop new treatment protocols. He felt more confident, more intelligent, and more capable than ever before. The Green Fairy, when properly controlled, seemed to be the perfect tool for medical advancement. As his tolerance increased, Dr. Moreau began consuming larger doses and experimenting with different concentrations of thujon. He synthesized his own absinthe, using pure chemicals obtained from pharmaceutical suppliers, creating formulations far more potent than anything available in commercial products. His private laboratory became a shrine to scientific inquiry, filled with precise measuring instruments, detailed charts tracking his consumption patterns, and extensive notes documenting his psychological and physiological responses. The transformation began so gradually that Dr. Moreau failed to recognize the warning signs he had observed in hundreds of his patients. His handwriting became more erratic, his behavior more unpredictable, and his interactions with colleagues increasingly paranoid and aggressive. He began to see patterns in medical data that other physicians couldn't detect, conspiracies among hospital staff that seemed obvious to him but invisible to everyone else, and connections between seemingly unrelated cases that suggested hidden truths about the nature of disease and healing. By the summer of 1898, 6 months after Prohibition had taken effect, Dr. Moreau was consuming amounts of absinthe that should have killed any normal person. But his medical knowledge allowed him to counteract many of the substance's toxic effects through carefully calculated doses of antidotes and supplements. He had essentially transformed himself into a walking experiment, a human laboratory for testing the limits of absinthe's effects on the human mind and body. The hospital staff began to notice disturbing changes in their respected colleague. Nurses reported that Dr. Moreau would sometimes stand motionless in patient rooms for long periods, staring at empty spaces as if observing invisible phenomena. Other physicians complained that his diagnostic methods had become increasingly bizarre, involving procedures and tests that seemed to have no basis in established medical practice. Patients began requesting different doctors after encountering Dr. Moreau's strange behavior during examinations. But the most troubling development was Dr. Moreau's growing obsession with what he called medical purification. He began to argue that many diseases were not biological problems, but spiritual corruptions that required drastic interventions to cure. He spoke of using controlled doses of absinthe to burn away the moral infections that he believed caused physical illness, and he started pressuring colleagues to participate in experimental treatments that bore no resemblance to conventional medicine. Dr. Moreau's journals from this period reveal a mind that was rapidly losing its connection to objective reality. His scientific observations became increasingly delusional, filled with references to mystical forces that governed human health and supernatural entities that communicated through medical symptoms. He wrote extensively about his conversations with the Green Fairy, who he claimed was teaching him advanced healing techniques that would revolutionize medical practice. The crisis reached its peak on September 23, 1898, when Dr. Moreau decided to test his most ambitious theory. He had become convinced that absinthe, when administered in precise doses during surgical procedures, could create a state of enhanced consciousness that would allow him to perceive and treat conditions that were invisible to conventional examination. He chose as his test subject Madame Céleste Dubois, a wealthy widow who had come to the hospital for treatment of chronic headaches. Madame Dubois was a pillar of Parisian society, known for her charitable work and cultural patronage. She had specifically requested treatment from Dr. Moreau because of his reputation as one of France's most innovative physicians. She had no idea that the distinguished doctor who greeted her that morning was operating under the influence of massive doses of absinthe and had planned to use her as a subject in his deranged experiments. Dr. Moreau's surgical notes from that day, discovered later by investigators, provide a horrifying glimpse into the mind of a brilliant physician completely destroyed by absinthe poisoning. He described seeing networks of corruption spreading through Madame Dubois' body, spiritual parasites that were feeding on her life force, and dimensional gateways that needed to be sealed through surgical intervention. What he actually did to the unfortunate woman was far worse than anything his delusional descriptions could convey. The surgery lasted for 6 hours, during which Dr. Moreau performed procedures that had no basis in medical science or human anatomy. He made incisions in patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic, visible only to his absinthe-poisoned mind, removed organs that showed no signs of disease, and attempted to cleanse his patient using techniques that belonged more to medieval torture than modern medicine. Nurses who assisted with the operation were so traumatized by what they witnessed that several required psychiatric treatment afterward. Madame Dubois survived the initial surgery, but died 3 days later from infections and complications resulting from Dr. Moreau's deranged interventions. Her death certificate listed the cause as surgical trauma resulting from experimental procedures. But the true cause was the Green Fairy's final victory over one of her most dedicated opponents. Dr. Moreau had spent years fighting absinthe's influence on others while succumbing to it himself, and his fall from respected healer to delusional butcher represented the ultimate corruption of everything he had once stood for. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Dr. Moreau's secret experiments and the role that absinthe had played in his transformation from healer to killer. Police searching his private laboratory discovered detailed records of his escalating consumption, chemical apparatus for synthesizing concentrated absinthe, and experimental notes that documented his gradual descent into madness. Most shocking of all were the journals in which he had meticulously recorded his conversations with hallucinated entities and his plans for purifying the medical profession through absinthe-enhanced surgery. Dr. Moreau's case sent shockwaves through the French medical establishment and provided devastating proof that even the most educated and disciplined individuals were vulnerable to absinthe's corrupting influence. Here was a man who understood the substance's dangers better than almost anyone else in France, who had seen its effects on hundreds of patients, who had publicly campaigned for its prohibition. Yet, he had still fallen victim to the Green Fairy's seductive promises, proving that scientific knowledge was no defense against chemical madness. The scandal destroyed public confidence in the medical profession and led to demands for comprehensive investigations of all physicians who had been involved in absinthe research. Hospitals throughout France began requiring regular psychological evaluations of their staff, while medical schools implemented new curricula focusing on the dangers of self-experimentation and the importance of maintaining professional objectivity when studying dangerous substances. Dr. Moreau's trial became another media sensation. But unlike previous absinthe-related cases, this one featured a defendant who was capable of articulating his delusions with scientific precision and medical authority. His testimony provided unprecedented insight into the psychological processes that absinthe triggered. As he described in clinical detail how the substance had gradually replaced his rational judgment with supernatural beliefs and transformed his healing mission into a crusade for mystical purification. The most chilling moment of the trial came when Dr. Moreau was asked to explain why he had killed Madame Dubois. His answer, delivered with the calm authority that had once made him one of France's most respected physicians, revealed the complete moral inversion that absinthe had accomplished in his mind. He explained that he had not killed his patient, but had attempted to save her from spiritual corruption that was far more dangerous than physical death. He insisted that his surgical procedures had been guided by divine inspiration, transmitted through the Green Fairy, and he expressed regret only that other doctors had been too cowardly to embrace similar revelations. The jury's verdict was unanimous and swift. Guilty of murder in the first degree, with a recommendation for life imprisonment rather than execution due to the defendant's obvious insanity. But the real impact of Dr. Moreau's case extended far beyond his individual fate. His fall from grace provided final, irrefutable proof that absinthe prohibition had been not only justified, but essential for protecting French society from complete collapse. The medical community responded to the scandal by establishing new protocols for substance abuse prevention among healthcare workers and implementing strict monitoring systems to detect early signs of professional impairment. These measures, initially developed to prevent future Dr. Moreaus, would eventually become standard practices that protected both patients and practitioners from a wide range of occupational hazards. Religious leaders seized on Dr. Moreau's case as evidence of divine justice, pointing out that even the most arrogant attempts to master the green fairy's power had ended in destruction and damnation. They organized special services of thanksgiving for the wisdom that had led France to ban absinthe before even more respected figures could be corrupted by its influence. The case became a powerful symbol in sermons about the dangers of pride and the importance of humility in the face of forces beyond human understanding. The international response to Dr. Moreau's crimes was equally dramatic. Foreign medical associations sent delegations to Paris to study the case and learn how to prevent similar tragedies in their own countries. The scandal accelerated absinthe prohibition movements throughout Europe and provided compelling evidence for temperance advocates who were fighting similar battles against other dangerous substances. But perhaps the most significant impact of Dr. Moreau's case was its effect on French attitudes toward expertise and authority. The revelation that one of the country's most respected physicians had been secretly conducting deranged experiments while publicly campaigning for prohibition shattered public faith in professional competence and institutional integrity. Citizens who had trusted medical authority without question began demanding greater transparency and accountability from their healthcare providers. This erosion of professional authority extended beyond medicine to affect other areas of French society. Government officials found themselves facing unprecedented scrutiny from citizens who had learned that even the most credentialed experts could be secretly corrupted by the very forces they claimed to oppose. The absinthe crisis had taught France that no one was immune to temptation and that vigilance was required at every level of society to prevent future disasters. Dr. Moreau spent his remaining years in the asylum at Charenton, where he continued his absinthe-fueled delusions until his death in 1904. Even in confinement, he maintained that his experiments had been misunderstood and that future generations would recognize his contributions to medical science. He used his privileges as a former physician to obtain writing materials and spent his final years composing elaborate treatises on spiritual surgery and chemical enlightenment that provided disturbing insights into the permanent damage that absinthe had inflicted on his once brilliant mind. His death marked the end of the most tragic chapter in France's struggle against the Green Fairy. The man who had helped save his country from absinthe had ultimately become its final victim, proving that even the most dedicated opponents of evil could be corrupted by the very forces they sought to destroy. His fall from grace served as a permanent reminder of the price that France had paid for its brief romance with liquid madness. The legacy of the absinthe crisis extended far beyond the immediate effects of prohibition. The experience had fundamentally changed French society's relationship with intoxication, creativity, and individual freedom. The Belle Époque's celebration of artistic rebellion and bohemian excess gave way to a more sober recognition of the dangers inherent in chemical enhancement of human consciousness. Artists who had once viewed absinthe as essential to their creative process were forced to develop new sources of inspiration. Many discovered that their natural talents were far greater than they had realized, having been suppressed rather than enhanced by chemical stimulation. The post-absinthe artistic renaissance produced some of France's greatest cultural achievements, as creators learned to draw inspiration from life itself rather than from artificial substances. The medical advances that emerged from studying absinthe addiction laid the groundwork for modern understanding of substance abuse and neurological disorders. Dr. Magnan's research on the effects of thujone on the human nervous system contributed to the development of new treatments for mental illness and addiction. The specialized clinics established to treat absinthe withdrawal became models for therapeutic institutions throughout Europe and America. The legal precedents established during the Prohibition campaign influenced legislation throughout the developed world. France's experience demonstrates societies could restrict that democratic dangerous substances without icing essential sacré freedoms, providing a template for future public health initiatives. The careful balance between individual liberty and collective welfare that French lawmakers achieved became a model for other nations facing similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, the absinthe crisis taught France valuable lessons about the nature of social change and cultural transformation. The country learned that even the most cherished traditions and beloved institutions could become dangerous if they escaped proper regulation and oversight. The experience prepared French society for the greater challenges that lay ahead, including the devastating wars and social upheavals of the 20th century. The Green Fairy's reign of terror had lasted less than 3 decades, but its impact on French civilization would endure for generations. The beautiful emerald liquid that had once symbolized artistic inspiration and bohemian freedom had revealed itself to be a chemical demon capable of destroying everything that made life worth living. France's victory over absinthe represented more than just successful prohibition. It demonstrated the capacity of democratic societies to recognize and correct their own mistakes before they became irreversible disasters. As the 19th century drew to a close, Paris once again deserved its title as the City of Light. The streets that had once run red with absinthe-fueled violence were safe again. The cafes that had been temples to chemical madness had returned to their proper role as centers of genuine intellectual discourse, and the artists who had worshipped false inspiration had rediscovered the true sources of human creativity. The Belle Époque would continue for another 16 years, but it would be a golden age built on authentic achievement rather than artificial enhancement. The Green Fairy was dead, but her ghost would continue to haunt French consciousness for decades to come. Every time society faced the temptation to seek easy solutions to difficult problems, every time individuals looked for chemical shortcuts to genuine accomplishment, the memory of the absinthe crisis would serve as a warning about the price of false transcendence. France had learned that some bargains were too dangerous to make, no matter how attractive they might appear. The country had paid an enormous price in blood and madness to acquire this wisdom. But that price had purchased something invaluable: the knowledge that human beings could overcome their darkest impulses and choose civilization over chaos, reality over illusion, authentic achievement over chemical fantasy. The Belle Époque was entering its final phase, do so with a clarity, but it would a vision that had been absent during the absinthe years. France had confronted its own capacity for self-destruction and emerged stronger for the struggle. The Green Fairy had tested French civilization and found it capable of choosing virtue over vice, collective welfare over individual pleasure, truth over beautiful lies. In the cafes of Montmartre, where the absinthe ritual had once dominated every evening, new traditions were emerging. Artists gathered to share ideas and inspiration, but they did so with minds unclouded by chemical influence and hearts uncompromised by artificial stimulation. The creativity that flowed from these gatherings was genuine and lasting, built on authentic human connection rather than shared delusion. The transformation was visible throughout Parisian society. Workers who had once sought escape from industrial monotony through absinthe-fueled fantasies now found meaning in labor unions, educational programs, and cultural activities that enriched their lives without destroying their minds. Intellectuals who had used the Green Fairy to enhance their philosophical insights discovered that clear thinking produced better ideas than chemical inspiration ever could. Even the criminals who had been created by absinthe's influence were finding redemption through the rehabilitation programs that Dr. Magnan and his colleagues had developed. Many of the murderers and violent offenders who had committed their crimes under the Green Fairy's influence were able to recover their humanity once the poison was purged from their systems. Their stories of recovery and redemption provided hope that even the worst forms of corruption could be overcome through proper treatment and social support. The economic benefits of prohibition were equally dramatic. The resources that had been devoted to dealing with absinthe-related crime, violence, and medical treatment were redirected toward productive investments in infrastructure, education, and industrial development. The insurance costs that had skyrocketed during the absinthe epidemic dropped to normal levels, while workplace productivity increased as employers no longer had to cope with chemically impaired workers. France was preparing itself for the new century with renewed confidence and moral clarity. The nation that had almost destroyed itself through chemical self-indulgence had emerged from the crisis with a deeper understanding of its own values and priorities. The Belle Époque's final years would be marked by achievements that reflected genuine human potential rather than artificial enhancement. But even as France celebrated its victory over the Green Fairy, troubling developments elsewhere in Europe suggested that the lessons of the absinthe crisis had not been universally learned. Reports were emerging from Germany of new synthetic substances that promised even more dramatic alterations of consciousness, while American pharmaceutical companies were developing powerful drugs that claimed to cure everything from depression to creativity blocks. The Green Fairy was dead, but her children were already being born in laboratories and factories throughout the industrialized world. France's experience with absinthe would prove to be not an ending, but a beginning. The first chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle with the temptation to chemically enhance or escape the human condition. The knowledge that France had gained at such terrible cost would be needed again and again as new substances emerged to challenge human wisdom and willpower. The techniques developed to combat absinthe addiction would be adapted to fight other forms of chemical dependency, while the legal and social frameworks created during Prohibition would provide templates for future battles against dangerous drugs. Most importantly, the moral lessons of the absinthe crisis would serve as a permanent reminder that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how attractive the promised benefits might appear. France had learned that true transcendence could not be purchased in bottles, that genuine creativity required discipline rather than chemical stimulation, and that authentic freedom meant the courage to face reality without artificial assistance. The Green Fairy's legacy would endure not as a symbol of lost innocence or abandoned pleasure, but as a warning about the eternal human tendency to seek easy answers to difficult questions. Every generation would face its own version of the absinthe temptation, its own Green Fairy promising transformation through chemical means. The story of Belle Époque Paris served as both cautionary tale and source of hope, proving that even the most seductive forms of corruption could be recognized and defeated by societies committed to truth over illusion. As the 19th century drew to its final close, the streets of Paris had indeed been cleansed of their green poison, but the scars left by the absinthe epidemic ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The city that had survived the Green Fairy's reign of terror was about to discover that some victories come with unexpected consequences, and that defeating one evil sometimes creates the conditions for new forms of darkness to emerge. The first signs of trouble appeared in the working-class districts of Veville and Belle-Ménilmontant, where former absinthe addicts were struggling to adjust to lives of chemical sobriety. These neighborhoods had been the heart of absinthe culture for decades, home to the factories and workshops where laborers had relied on the Green Fairy to escape the monotony of industrial life. Without their chemical crutch, many workers found themselves facing a reality that seemed unbearably grey and meaningless. Among these struggling souls was Pierre Beaumont, a 38-year-old metalworker who had consumed absinthe daily for 15 years before Prohibition forced him into unwilling sobriety. Pierre had been one of the lucky ones during the absinthe years, managing to maintain his job and avoid the violent outbursts that had destroyed so many of his contemporaries. His addiction had been quiet, a private and controlled ritual that had made his 12-hour shifts at the foundry bearable. But sobriety brought Pierre no relief from the grinding poverty and exhausting labour that had driven him to absinthe in the first place. Without the Green Fairy's false promise of transcendence, he found himself confronting the full weight of his circumstances with brutal clarity. His tiny apartment was a monument to failure. His work was meaningless drudgery, and his future held nothing but more of the same until death finally released him from his suffering. Pierre's despair was shared by thousands of other drinkers throughout former absinthe Paris. The rehabilitation programs developed by Dr. Magnan had been remarkably successful at purging the poison from their bodies, but they had done nothing to address the underlying social conditions that had made chemical escape seem necessary in the first place. These men and women found themselves clean and sober, but still trapped in lives of quiet desperation. The problem was particularly acute among the artistic community of Montmartre, where absinthe had been more than just a drink, but a sacred sacrament that connected creators to their deepest sources of inspiration. Many painters and writers discovered that sobriety brought not clarity, but creative paralysis, as the visions and insights that had once flowed so freely under absinthe's influence now seemed completely inaccessible. René Dubois was perhaps the most tragic example of this phenomenon. Before Prohibition, he had been one of Montmartre's most promising young painters, creating canvases that captured the energy and passion of Parisian street life with remarkable intensity. His work had sold well to collectors who appreciated his unique ability to translate the chaos of urban existence into coherent artistic statements. But René's creative process had been entirely dependent on his nightly communion with the Green Fairy. When Prohibition forced him to abandon absinthe, René's artistic abilities simply vanished. He would sit before blank canvases for hours, brush in hand, waiting for inspiration that never came. The vibrant colours and dynamic compositions that had once poured from his imagination were replaced by grey emptiness that mocked his desperate attempts to recapture his former gifts. Within 6 months of Prohibition, René had stopped painting entirely, convinced that his talent had died with the Green Fairy. The economic consequences of this creative drought were devastating for Paris's art market. Galleries that had thrived during the Absinthe years found themselves with nothing new to sell, as artists throughout the city struggled with similar creative paralysis. Collectors who had invested heavily in works created under Absinthe's influence watched their collections lose value as public taste shifted away from what critics were now calling chemical art. The cultural establishment responded to this crisis by promoting a new movement that they called authentic naturalism, which celebrated artistic creation that emerged from direct observation of life rather than chemical enhancement. Museums organized exhibitions showcasing the work of sober artists, while critics wrote lengthy essays explaining why drug-free creativity was morally and aesthetically superior to its chemically influenced predecessors. But this official promotion of sober art could not address the fundamental problem that many artists genuinely could not function without their chemical muse. The Green Fairy had not merely inspired their brew, she had actually gained in ways that made ordinary consciousness seem inadequate for creative expression. These artists found themselves caught between a society that demanded chemical purity and a creative process that required chemical stimulation. The tension between these competing demands led to the emergence of what historians would later call the underground Renaissance. Hidden throughout Paris were secret societies of artists who had found ways to continue their relationships with forbidden substances, creating works that could never be exhibited publicly, but that represented some of the most innovative and powerful art of the period. These underground artists did not simply continue drinking illegal absinthe, though some certainly did. Many experimented with other substances that had not yet been banned, including various forms of hashish, opium derivatives, and exotic plant extracts imported from French colonies in Africa and Asia. Others developed elaborate techniques for extracting and concentrating the active compounds from legal substances like wine and tobacco, creating new forms of intoxication that produced effects similar to absinthe. The most sophisticated of these underground laboratories was operated by a former chemistry professor named Dr. Auguste Moreau, no relation to the infamous Philippe Moreau, who had murdered Madame Dubois. This Auguste Moreau had been dismissed from the University of Paris after publicly defending absinthe's role in advancing human consciousness, but his expertise in organic chemistry made him invaluable to artists seeking chemical alternatives to the banned Green Fairy. Dr. Moreau's laboratory, hidden in the basement of a seemingly respectable bookshop in the Latin Quarter, became a pilgrimage destination for artists throughout Europe who were seeking new forms of chemical inspiration. He developed dozens of synthetic compounds that he claimed could reproduce and enhance Absinthe's consciousness, altering effects while avoiding the toxic side effects that had made the original substance so dangerous. His most popular creation was a crystalline powder that he called Essence of Inspiration, which could be dissolved in wine or coffee to create a beverage that reportedly enhanced creativity without producing the violent hallucinations associated with absinthe. Artists who used Dr. Moreau's concoctions reported experiencing vivid visual and auditory hallucinations, enhanced emotional sensitivity, and access to ideas and images that seemed to come from beyond ordinary consciousness. The underground art that emerged from these chemical experiments was unlike anything that had been created during the Absinthe years, where absinthe-influenced work had often been chaotic and violent, reflecting the green fairy's destructive nature. The new chemical art was characterized by intricate geometric patterns, impossible architectural structures, and landscapes that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond normal space and time. One of Dr. Moreau's most devoted clients was Marguerite Rousseau, a young sculptor who had begun her career just as absinthe prohibition was taking effect. Marguerite had never experienced the green fairy's influence directly, but she had grown up surrounded by absinthe-influenced art and felt that sober creativity was somehow incomplete and inadequate. She became obsessed with finding ways to access the visionary states that had produced the masterpieces she admired. Under the influence of Dr. Moreau's synthetic compounds, Marguerite created sculptures that seemed to defy the laws of physics and geometry. Her works featured impossible curves that appeared to fold back on themselves, surfaces that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles, and formed movement that suggested even though they were carved from solid stone. Critics who saw her work in underground exhibitions described it as architecture for dreams and blueprints for alternate realities. But Marguerite's chemical experiments came with a price that she did not initially recognize. Dr. Moreau's synthetic compounds were far more potent than natural absinthe, and their long-term effects on the human nervous system were completely unknown. As her consumption increased, Marguerite began experiencing the same symptoms that had characterized advanced absinthism: paranoid delusions, violent mood swings, and gradual disconnection from objective reality. The transformation reached its climax during the winter of 1901, when Marguerite became convinced that her sculptures were actually alive and were communicating with her through telepathic messages. She began spending entire days and nights in her studio, having elaborate conversations with her stone creations and receiving what she believed were instructions for increasingly complex and ambitious works. Her final sculpture, which she called The Portal to Eternity, was discovered by police after neighbors complained about strange sounds and smells coming from her studio. The work itself was unlike anything that had ever been created by human hands, a twisted mass of stone and metal that seemed to pulse with its own inner life. But more disturbing than the sculpture itself was what investigators found surrounding it. Marguerite had apparently spent her final weeks attempting to feed her creation by offering it increasingly elaborate sacrifices. The studio was filled with the remains of cats, dogs, and other small animals that had been arranged in ritualistic patterns around the sculpture. Most horrifying of all were the indications that Marguerite had begun cutting pieces of flesh from her own body to offer to her stone creation, believing that it required human blood to achieve full consciousness. When police finally located Marguerite, she was found in a state of complete psychological collapse, her body covered with self-inflicted wounds and her mind completely detached from reality. She claimed that her sculpture had achieved sentience and was preparing to open a gateway to other dimensions, allowing beings from alternate realities to enter our world. She begged the officers to destroy the sculpture before it could complete its mission, but also pleaded with them to preserve it as humanity's greatest artistic achievement. Dr. Auguste Moreau was arrested within hours of Marguerite's discovery, as investigators quickly traced her condition to the synthetic compounds he had been supplying. When police raided his laboratory, they found evidence of dozens of similar cases among his clientele. Artists throughout Paris had been secretly consuming his chemical creations, and many were showing signs of psychological deterioration that paralleled or exceeded the worst cases of absinthism from the previous decade. The scandal that followed Moreau's arrest revealed the full extent of the underground chemical renaissance that had been flourishing beneath the surface of post-prohibition Parisian society. Newspapers published exposés detailing the secret networks of artists, intellectuals, and wealthy collectors who had been funding illegal chemical experiments in pursuit of enhanced creativity. The public learned that many of the most celebrated works of the authentic naturalism movement had actually been created under the influence of synthetic drugs that were potentially more dangerous than absinthe itself. The revelation that the post-absinthe cultural renaissance had been built on new forms of chemical deception shattered public confidence in artistic institutions and cultural authorities. Citizens who had celebrated France's victory over the Green Fairy discovered that they had simply driven the problem underground, where it had mutated into forms that were potentially more dangerous than the original threat. Government officials found themselves facing demands for even more comprehensive prohibition laws that would ban not just specific substances, but entire categories of chemical compounds that could potentially be used for consciousness alteration. Scientists argued that such broad prohibitions would interfere with legitimate pharmaceutical research, while artists protested that any substance capable of affecting human consciousness was potentially valuable for creative purposes. The debate was complicated by the fact that many of Dr. Moreau's synthetic compounds had shown genuine therapeutic value when used in controlled medical settings. Several of his formulations had proven effective for treating severe depression, chronic pain, and other conditions that had previously been considered incurable. The challenge was finding ways to preserve the beneficial applications of these substances while preventing their abuse by artists and thrill-seekers. Dr. Magnan, now recognized as France's leading expert on chemical addiction, was called upon to lead a comprehensive investigation into the underground drug culture that had emerged in the wake of absinthe prohibition. His research team spent months documenting the various substances that had been developed as absinthe alternatives, analyzing their chemical structures and cataloging their effects on human physiology and psychology. The results of this investigation were both fascinating and terrifying. Dr. Magnan discovered that the human brain's capacity for chemical alteration was virtually limitless, and that creative individuals seemed particularly susceptible to substances that enhanced pattern recognition and visual processing. He documented dozens of different compounds that could produce effects ranging from mild euphoria to complete disconnection from reality, each with its own unique profile of benefits and dangers. More disturbing was Dr. Magnan's conclusion that the underground drug culture represented an evolutionary response to prohibition, rather than a simple continuation of the absinthe epidemic. The artists and chemists who had created these new substances had learned from the mistakes of the absinthe years, developing compounds that were more subtle in their effects and less likely to produce the obvious symptoms that had made absinthe addiction easy to detect. This new generation of chemical creativity posed challenges that were far more complex than anything France had faced during the absinthe crisis. Where absinthe had been a single substance with well-documented effects, the underground renaissance had produced dozens of different compounds, each with unique properties and unpredictable interactions. Traditional prohibition strategies that had worked against absinthe were completely inadequate for addressing this more sophisticated form of chemical creativity. Dr. Magnan's recommendations for dealing with the underground drug culture reflected the lessons he had learned from the absinthe crisis, while acknowledging the new complexities that had emerged. He argued that simple prohibition was insufficient and potentially counterproductive, as it drove dangerous experimentation underground, where it could not be monitored or controlled. Instead, he proposed a system of regulated access that would allow legitimate research and therapeutic use while preventing recreational abuse. His proposal included the establishment of licensed laboratories where approved researchers could study consciousness-altering substances under controlled conditions, medical clinics where qualified physicians could prescribe these substances for specific therapeutic purposes, and educational programs that would teach the public about the risks and benefits of chemical consciousness alteration. Most controversially, he suggested that certain mild consciousness-altering substances might be made available to artists and writers under strict supervision, allowing for creative exploration while preventing the kind of uncontrolled experimentation that had destroyed artists like Marguerite Rousseau. The public response to Dr. Magnan's proposals was intensely divided. Conservative groups argued that any form of legal chemical consciousness alteration would inevitably lead back to the chaos of the Absinthe years, while progressive voices claimed that prohibition had failed and that regulated access was the only realistic solution. Artists and intellectuals were particularly vocal in supporting Dr. Magnan's recommendations, arguing that creative expression required access to altered states of consciousness, and that society had a responsibility to provide safe alternatives to dangerous underground experimentation. The debate raged throughout 1902 and 1903, with newspapers publishing daily editorials arguing both sides of the question. Public meetings were organized throughout France to discuss the issue, often drawing crowds of thousands who listened to speeches by medical experts, religious leaders, government officials, and cultural figures. The question of how to balance individual freedom with public safety had become one of the defining political issues of the new century. The resolution of this debate would ultimately be determined not by philosophical arguments or political considerations, but by a series of events that demonstrate of tragic the inadequacy of existing approaches to chemical consciousness alteration. The underground responded drug culture that had emerged into absinthe prohibition was about to produce catastrophes that would make the original absinthe crisis seem modest by comparison. The catalyst for this new disaster was a brilliant young chemist named Henri Dubois, who had been working with Dr. Auguste Moreau before the latter's arrest. Henri had continued the research in his own private laboratory, developing what he believed would be the ultimate consciousness-altering substance, a compound that combined the creative enhancement of absinthe with the spiritual transcendence of religious mysticism and the intellectual clarity of pure scientific thought. Henri called his creation synthesis, and he believed it represented the next stage in human evolution. Unlike the crude plant extracts and simple synthetic compounds that had preceded it, synthesis was designed to enhance specific aspects of consciousness while leaving others completely unaffected. Users would experience enhanced creativity, expanded sensory perception, and access to what Henri described as trans-dimensional intelligence, while retaining complete rational control over their actions. The first test subjects for synthesis were volunteers from Paris's underground artistic community, individuals who had become frustrated with the limitations of existing consciousness-altering substances and were eager to experience Henri's promised breakthrough. The initial results seemed to confirm his most optimistic predictions. Users reported experiencing creative insights that far exceeded anything they had achieved with absinthe or other substances, while showing none of the violent or erratic behavior that had characterized earlier chemical experiments. Word of Henri's success spread quickly through underground networks, and soon dozens of artists, writers, and intellectuals were making pilgrimages to his laboratory to experience synthesis for themselves. Unlike previous consciousness-altering substances, which had typically been consumed in social settings, synthesis was designed for solitary use, allowing individuals to explore their enhanced consciousness without distraction or interference from others. The effects of synthesis were unlike anything that had been documented in the history of human chemical experimentation. Users reported experiencing complete unity with the universe, access to infinite knowledge and wisdom, and the ability to perceive reality from perspectives that transcended normal human limitations. They described encountering intelligent entities from other dimensions, receiving communications from advanced civilizations, and gaining insights into the fundamental nature of existence itself. Most remarkably, these extraordinary experiences seemed to produce lasting benefits, even after the chemical effects had worn off. Artists who had used synthesis created works of unprecedented complexity and beauty, while writers produced literature that critics described as representing entirely new forms of human expression. Scientists and philosophers reported breakthrough insights that advanced their fields in ways that seemed almost impossible for individual human minds to achieve. For several months, it appeared that Henri Dubois had actually succeeded in creating the perfect consciousness-altering substance, one that provided all the benefits of chemical enhancement while avoiding the dangers that had made absinthe and its successors so problematic. The underground artistic community began to view synthesis as the ultimate vindication of their approach to creativity, proof that human consciousness could be safely and beneficially enhanced through careful chemical intervention. But as more individuals began using synthesis on a regular basis, subtle warning signs began to emerge that suggested Henri's creation might not be as safe as it initially appeared. Users began reporting that ordinary consciousness seemed increasingly inadequate after experiencing the expanded awareness that synthesis provided. Many found themselves unable to function effectively in normal social situations, as their enhanced perceptual abilities made regular human interaction seem shallow and meaningless. More troubling were reports of users becoming convinced that the entities they encountered during synthesis experiences were real beings who continued to communicate with them even when they were not under the substance's influence. Many began making major life decisions based on guidance they claimed to receive from these trans-dimensional intelligences, abandoning careers, relationships, and responsibilities in pursuit of missions that seemed incomprehensible to outside observers. The first clear indication that synthesis posed a serious threat to public safety came in the spring of 1903, when a group of 12 users decided to conduct what they called the Great Convergence, a collective experiment designed to allow their enhanced consciousnesses to merge into a single super-intelligent entity. The group gathered in an abandoned warehouse in Montmartre, where they consumed massive doses of synthesis while attempting to synchronize their experiences through elaborate ritual preparations. What happened during the Great Convergence was never fully understood, as the only witnesses were the participants themselves, and their subsequent testimonies were so bizarre and contradictory that investigators could make no sense of them. When police discovered the warehouse 3 days later, they found a scene that defied rational explanation. The 12 participants were arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies showing no signs of violence or injury, but their minds completely disconnected from objective reality. Unlike previous cases of chemical-induced madness, where victims had typically exhibited violent or erratic behavior, the synthesis users had become completely catatonic. They sat motionless for hours at a time, staring into space with expressions of profound concentration, occasionally muttering fragments of what sounded like complex mathematical equations or philosophical arguments. When questioned by investigators, they claimed to be engaged in crucial work for beings from other dimensions, but they were completely unable to explain the nature of this work in terms that ordinary humans could understand. Dr. Magnan's examination of the convergence participants revealed neurological changes that were unlike anything he had previously documented. Their brain activity showed patterns that seemed to indicate constant engagement with complex cognitive tasks. But these patterns bore no resemblance to normal human thought processes. Most disturbing of all was the fact that the participants' conditions showed no signs of improvement over time, suggesting that synthesis had produced permanent alterations in their brain chemistry. The Great Convergence incident shattered that chemical myth consciousness alteration could be safely controlled through scientific methodology and careful preparation. Here were 12 of the most intelligent and experienced users of consciousness-altering substances in Paris, individuals who had approached synthesis with elaborate precautions and sophisticated understanding of its effects. Yet they had still succumbed to a form of madness that was potentially more complete and irreversible than anything produced by Absinthe or its underground successors. Henri Dubois' reaction to the Convergence disaster revealed that he had become as delusional as his most damaged users. When confronted with evidence of synthesis's dangers, he claimed that the 12 participants had actually succeeded in their goal of transcending human consciousness, and that their apparent madness was simply the result of existing in a state of awareness that ordinary humans could not comprehend. He argued that they represented the next stage of human evolution, and that their condition should be studied and celebrated rather than treated as a medical emergency. This response convinced authorities that Henri himself had become a victim of his own creation, his judgment compromised by prolonged exposure to synthesis, and his scientific objectivity replaced by grandiose delusions about human transcendence. When police attempted to arrest him, Henri barricaded himself in his laboratory and threatened to release large quantities of synthesis into Paris's water supply unless his work was allowed to continue. The siege of Henri's laboratory lasted for 6 days, during which he broadcast rambling manifestos through a primitive radio transmitter, explaining his theories about consciousness evolution and demanding that the French government establish research institutes dedicated to studying transdimensional intelligence. His broadcasts were monitored throughout Europe and America, providing the international community with disturbing insights into the kind of madness that could result from unchecked chemical experimentation. The siege ended when Henri apparently consumed a massive overdose of synthesis, believing that this would allow him to permanently merge his consciousness with the transdimensional entities he claimed to have contacted. When police finally entered his laboratory, they found his body in a state that investigators described as chemically mummified, his tissues preserved by the massive concentrations of synthetic compounds in his system. The laboratory itself was filled with elaborate diagrams and equations that Henri had apparently been working on during his final days, complex mathematical formulations that seemed to describe impossible geometric structures and theoretical frameworks for communicating with beings from alternate realities. Chemical analysis revealed that he had been synthesizing increasingly potent versions of synthesis, creating compounds that were hundreds of times more concentrated than anything he had previously produced. The discovery of Henri's laboratory and the revelation of synthesis's true dangers triggered a public panic that exceeded anything experienced during the original Absinthe crisis. The French government declared a state of national emergency and implemented martial law in districts where underground chemical experimentation was suspected to be occurring. Police raids throughout Paris uncovered dozens of illegal laboratories, many of which were found to contain substances that were potentially more dangerous than anything that had been previously discovered. The international response was equally dramatic, as governments throughout Europe and America implemented emergency legislation designed to prevent the spread of synthetic consciousness-altering substances. Scientific conferences were organized to share information about the new chemical threats, while diplomatic protocols were established for coordinating responses to future incidents involving dangerous synthetic compounds. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the synthesis crisis was its effect on public attitudes toward chemical consciousness alteration in general. The revelation that even the most sophisticated scientific approaches to consciousness enhancement could produce catastrophic results convinced many French citizens that any form of chemical alteration of human awareness was inherently dangerous and should be completely prohibited. This shift in public opinion led to the passage of the Comprehensive Chemical Safety Act in 1904, legislation that banned not just specific substances but entire categories of compounds that could potentially affect human consciousness. The law established severe criminal penalties for manufacturing, distributing, or using any substance designed to alter mental states, while providing extensive funding for enforcement and treatment programs. The new legislation was far more restrictive than the original Absinthe prohibition, reflecting the hard lessons that French society had learned about the creative ways that human ingenuity could circumvent simple bans on specific substances. The law included provisions for monitoring chemical research, regulating pharmaceutical development, and investigating any unusual patterns of behavior that might indicate the emergence of new consciousness-altering substances. The implementation of comprehensive chemical prohibition marked the end of France's brief experiment with underground consciousness alteration, but it also raised profound questions about the relationship between individual freedom and collective security in modern society. Critics argued that the new laws represented an unprecedented intrusion into personal autonomy, while supporters maintained that the protection of public safety justified even the most restrictive measures. The debate over these questions would continue for decades, influencing discussions about drug policy, medical research, and individual rights throughout the developed world. The French experience with absinthe and its synthetic successors had demonstrated both the allure and the dangers of chemical consciousness alteration, providing valuable lessons about the challenges that modern societies would face as scientific knowledge continued to expand the possibilities for altering human experience. Époque enter, as the Belle its final decade. France had something to achieve unprecedented in human history, a society that had successfully identified and eliminated a major threat to public safety while preserving the essential freedoms that made civilization worth defending. The victory had come at enormous cost, measured not just in lives lost and minds destroyed, but in the necessary sacrifice of certain forms of individual liberty for the sake of collective survival. The Green Fairy and her synthetic offspring had taught France that some forms of human experience were simply too dangerous to permit, regardless of their potential benefits or cultural significance. This lesson would serve the nation well in the challenges that lay ahead, as the 20th century would bring new threats to human consciousness and social stability that would require all the wisdom and courage that the absinthe crisis had helped to develop. But even as France celebrated its hard-won victory over chemical chaos, thoughtful observers recognized that the underlying human desires that had made absinthe and synthesis so attractive had not been eliminated by prohibition. The longing for transcendence, the search for enhanced creativity, and the desire to escape the limitations of ordinary consciousness remained as powerful as ever, waiting for new outlets and new opportunities for expression. The challenge for future generations would be finding ways to address these fundamental human needs without repeating the tragic mistakes of the absinthe years. France had learned to say no to chemical solutions, but it had yet to discover what positive alternatives might satisfy the deeper spiritual and creative hungers that had made the Green Fairy so seductive in the first place. That search for alternatives would soon find expression in unexpected ways, as French society discovered that the human spirit's need for transcendence could not be legislated out of existence. The comprehensive prohibition of consciousness-altering substances had created a vacuum that demanded to be filled, and nature, as always, abhorred such emptiness. In-class districts where absinthe had once provided escape from industrial monotony, new forms of collective experience began emerging. Workers who had previously sought solitude with the Green Fairy now gathered in secret societies that explored altered states of consciousness through entirely different means. These groups, which called themselves Circles of Awakening, developed elaborate techniques of group meditation, rhythmic breathing, and synchronized movement that could produce profound psychological effects without any chemical assistance. The leader of the most influential circle was a former metalworker named Baptiste Moreau, who had lost his job after the factory owners discovered his absinthe addiction. Baptiste had spent 2 years in Dr. Magnan's rehabilitation program, where he had learned not just to live without chemical enhancement, but to access altered states through what he called natural methods. His techniques combined elements of Eastern meditation practices with traditional French folk rituals, creating experiences that participants described as more profound than anything they had achieved with absinthe. Baptiste's circle met every Tuesday evening in the basement of an abandoned church in Belleville, where members would spend hours engaged in practices designed to unlock what Baptiste called the chemistry of the soul. These sessions began with elaborate breathing exercises that participants performed in perfect synchronization, creating a collective rhythm that seemed to pulse through the entire gathering. As the evening progressed, the breathing would give way to chanting, then to movements that became increasingly complex and hypnotic. Participants reported that these natural techniques could produce visions that rivaled anything they had experienced with chemical substances. They described encountering spiritual entities that provided guidance and inspiration, accessing memories and insights that seemed to come from beyond their individual consciousness, and achieving states of unity with the universe that lasted for hours after the sessions ended. More importantly, these natural altered states produced none of the destructive side effects that had made chemical consciousness alteration so dangerous. Members of Baptiste's circle maintained their jobs and relationships, showed no signs of the violent behavior that had characterized absinthe addiction, and seemed to benefit from enhanced creativity and emotional stability rather than the deterioration that had marked the chemical approach to transcendence. Word of Baptiste's success spread throughout the working-class districts, and soon dozens of similar circles were forming throughout Paris. Each group developed its own unique approaches to natural consciousness alteration, drawing on traditions from around the world and adapting them to the specific needs of French industrial society. Some focused on dance and movement, others emphasized vocal techniques and sound, while still others explored the consciousness-altering potential of extreme physical disciplines. The most sophisticated of these groups was led by Céleste Dubois, a former seamstress who had discovered that certain combinations of fasting, sleep deprivation, and sensory stimulation could produce experiences that she described as divine communication. Céleste's circle specialized in what they called sacred suffering, deliberately subjecting themselves to controlled forms of physical discomfort that seemed to trigger profound spiritual insights. Céleste had developed her techniques during her own recovery from absinthe addiction, when she had noticed that the withdrawal symptoms sometimes produced moments of extraordinary clarity and revelation. She began experimenting with ways to recreate these moments without the dangerous chemicals, eventually discovering that the human body possessed its own capacity for generating altered states of consciousness through carefully controlled stress and stimulation. Her circle's practices were far more extreme than those employed by other groups. Members would fast for days at a time while engaging in exhausting physical exercises, deliberately exposing themselves to cold, heat, and pain in patterns that Céleste claimed could unlock hidden potentials within human consciousness. These practices were dangerous in their own right, but they seemed to produce genuine spiritual experiences without the mental deterioration that had characterized chemical approaches to transcendence. The authorities initially viewed these circles with suspicion, concerned that they might be cover operations for continued chemical experimentation. Police raids of several groups revealed no evidence of illegal substances, but investigators were disturbed by what they observed of the natural techniques being employed. The sight of dozens of French citizens voluntarily subjecting themselves to extreme psychological stress seemed almost as alarming as the chemical madness that had preceded it. Dr. Magnan was called upon to investigate these new forms of consciousness alteration and determine whether they posed threats to public safety comparable to those presented by absinthe and its synthetic successors. His initial examinations of circle members revealed no signs of the neurological damage that characterized chemical addiction, but he documented psychological changes that were nonetheless significant and potentially concerning. Circle members showed increased sensitivity to sensory stimulation, enhanced pattern recognition abilities, and altered sleep patterns that seemed to reflect permanent changes in their brain chemistry. Most intriguingly, many displayed what Dr. Magnan described as enhanced empathic capacity, an ability to sense and respond to the emotional states of others that far exceeded normal human capabilities. These changes were not necessarily harmful, and in many cases seemed to represent genuine improvements in psychological function and social integration. Circle members reported better relationships with family and friends, increased job satisfaction, and greater sense of meaning and purpose in their daily lives. They seem to have found ways to access the transcendent experiences that had made chemical consciousness alteration so attractive while avoiding the destructive consequences that had made prohibition necessary. But Dr. Magnan's research also revealed troubling aspects of the circle phenomenon that suggested potential dangers ahead. Many members showed signs of what he termed spiritual addiction, an obsessive dependence on their group practices that seemed to replicate some of the behavioral patterns associated with chemical dependency. They organized their entire lives around circle meetings, neglected other responsibilities in favor of their spiritual practices, and showed withdrawal symptoms when prevented from participating in group activities. More concerning was the tendency of some circles to develop increasingly extreme practices as members built tolerance to their initial techniques. What had begun as simple breathing exercises evolved into elaborate rituals involving sleep deprivation, extreme fasting, and forms of self-mortification that bordered on torture. The human capacity for adaptation meant that achieving the same level of altered consciousness required progressively more intense stimulation, creating a spiral of escalation that paralleled the progression seen in chemical addiction. The most dramatic example of this escalation occurred within Celeste Dubois' circle during the winter of 1905. Celeste had become convinced that her group was approaching a breakthrough that would allow them to achieve permanent transcendence of ordinary human consciousness without the need for continued practices or group support. She announced that they would attempt what she called the final awakening, a ritual that would transform all participants into what she described as beings of pure spirit. The final awakening was scheduled to take place during the winter solstice, when Celeste believed that cosmic forces would be most favorable for spiritual transformation. The ritual required participants to fast for 2 weeks while engaging in continuous physical exercises designed to exhaust their bodies and liberate their souls. They would then gather in an abandoned warehouse where they would subject themselves to extreme cold while performing synchronized movements that Celeste claimed would open gateways to higher dimensions. 23 members of Celeste's circle participated in the final awakening, including several individuals who had previously been considered models of successful recovery from absinthe addiction. The ritual lasted for 3 days and nights, during which participants pushed their bodies far beyond normal limits of endurance while maintaining the psychological focus that their practices required. When police discovered the warehouse on the 4th day, they found a scene that was eerily reminiscent of the Great Convergence incident that had ended Henri Dubois' chemical experiments. The 23 participants were arranged in elaborate geometric patterns, their bodies showing signs of severe malnutrition and exposure, but their faces expressing the same profound concentration that had characterized the synthesis victims. Unlike the chemical casualties, however, the circle members were not catatonic. They continued to perform their ritualistic movements with mechanical precision, seemingly unaware of their physical deterioration or the presence of outside observers. When investigators attempted to interrupt their activities, the participants responded with coordinated resistance that suggested they were operating as a single collective entity rather than as individual human beings. Dr. Magnan's examination of the final awakening participants revealed that their natural techniques had produced neurological changes that were in some ways more profound than anything achieved through chemical means. Their brain activity showed patterns of perfect synchronization, as if their individual consciousnesses had actually merged into a single collective mind. They seemed to share thoughts, memories, and sensations in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human identity and consciousness. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that these changes appeared to be irreversible. Unlike chemical alterations that could potentially be treated through detoxification and rehabilitation, the neurological modifications produced by extreme natural techniques seemed to represent permanent rewiring of the participants' brain structure. They had achieved the transcendence they sought, but at the cost of their individual humanity. And so, the Green Fairy's reign of terror finally came to an end, but not in the way anyone had expected. France had learned that the human hunger for transcendence could not be legislated away, only transformed into new, and sometimes equally dangerous forms. The Belle Époque closed with a society that had gained profound wisdom about the price of false salvation, whether chemical or natural. The streets of Paris were safer, but the deeper questions about human consciousness and the eternal search for meaning remained as mysterious as ever. Perhaps that was the Green Fairy's final lesson, that some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, and some hungers are meant to remain forever unsatisfied.